Good afternoon, hello, good morning. We're happy to start our today's conversation with Franziska Thun-Hohenstein. Very recently, she has published a new book. It's Varlam Shalamov biography in German. So today we have the opportunity to discuss that book in other languages that we may know, because I doubt that any of us already have that book in German. This is a result of a work that a small scale work of 6 and 7 years, but in larger terms, it's at least 20 years. Well, a little bit less, says Franziska, just a little less. Yes, because the first translations, how many volumes of translations of Shalamov into German have been published? 8? Yes, 8. And the first one appeared in 2007. So since 2005, approximately, it's almost 20 years. And it's always been Shalamov, either translations of Shalamov or articles about him. Rather complicated literary theory works about poetics of Shalamov. And now finally the book has appeared, written and addressed to a wider public, German-speaking readers, knowing about Shalamov, that amount of information that is available in German. And so all those complicated matters of theory of poetics and everything and the likes are expressed and brought to the readers in a simpler manner and a simpler language. Thank you, Franziska, for this, for the opportunity to have this conversation. And I will ask you probably to start with your presentation, so that we could see a little bit of a glimpse of the book itself, and some key aspects of the book, and then we will be able to discuss it and ask questions. Great. Thank you so much, Olga, for inviting me to introduce my book and discuss it. Let me try to share my presentation. I hope it works. Do you see it? Yes. Great. This is the cover of the book. As you can see on my screen, the book is rather a thick volume, because besides my narrative, there are also comments. And I also included the large a set of biography list of all the persons mentioned in the biography. So let me start with the most important. I am a philologist, as Olga said. I'm a historian of literature. And I was looking for the approach for Shalamov, his life and work of a poet and writer who went through the hell of Kolyma camps for a long time, ripped out of what is commonly called Norman life. I searched the approach to his life through his texts, and I was quite aware of the risk of such an endeavor. And as Ola has already said, the book is written for a wide German-speaking readership. And the title of the book, of course, is a complicated one. Varlam Shalamov, Biography and Poetics. It's not just the biography. I set myself a task to listen to the inner, insistent conversation that of Shalamov had within himself about a man after the catastrophes of the 20th century, about his life, about art, about the paths of Russian literature, about the possibilities that are given by the poetic word. I was looking for a form of scholarly grounded biographical narrative that focused on Shalamov's desire to find his own place in literature and to make sense of his destiny, his fate, against the backdrop of his contemporary era of Russian and Soviet history. It was necessary to acquaint the reader, of course, with the main milestones of the historical and cultural context and circumstances that prevented Shalamov from getting the recognition he had hoped since his young years. As I already mentioned, even the title of the book, Biography and Poetics, required, and it was originally my task I set for myself, to give a special place to the poetics, both of Shalamov as the novelist and as far as it was possible in German, of Shalamov the poet. The 8 volumes that have been published in German in the set of Shalamov's works, there's no poetry yet, but Gabriel Leopold, translator of Shalamov into German, intentionally translated some of the poems. Now I've had a small problem. I'm not able to move the slide to the next page. Oh, now it works. Together with her in parallel, we've prepared for publication a volume of Shalamov's selected letters and correspondence with detailed commentary, and that has also helped enormously in my work. So the task I set myself was to become as thoroughly acquainted as possible with Shalamov's written legacy, which was not possible in its entirety. Some of my search overlapped with the publications of recent years, first and foremost the 2 volumes of poems and new chapters of Fischer anti-novel. The question of Shalamov's written legacy is a separate topic. I will only point out that part of the legacy that is stored and kept in Moscow in the private archive of Sergei Grigoryan's and is still unreachable. I had only very selective look and access to those materials and was able to quote some of them. I will refer, for example, to the metapoetic reflections taken down by Shalamov in the draft version of the story The Glove, but which he had thrown out thrown himself from the typed text. You see at the dotted line on the left page, the paragraph that is that was crossed out. When I felt myself to be a prophet, just as Anderson, I quoted this paragraph in my article in the issue of 85 of the Wiener Slawische Almanac. And in general, a detailed study of the archive and of the creation process of many of Shalamov's poetic and prosaic texts has yet to be undertaken and requires studying of archives. So some judgments, in my view, can only be of a preliminary nature. A biographer of Shalamov faces many challenges. I want to share my thoughts on 3 interrelated problems. The first one is consistency and discontinuity of presentation. The principles of biographical description of the life of a historical figure can be very different. Yet the very genre of biography in the tradition of the European educational novel is usually identified with a chronological account of a character's life from childhood through the possible twists and turns of adolescence to adulthood. But I set myself a question: is this kind of chronological narrative of Shalamov's life, is it acceptable, such narrative of a life broken into separate segments as a result of the state policy of terror? And looking for the answer to this question, I try to find a form of narrative, biographical writing that would convey this fragmentation and reveal ways to resurrect the poetic word in Shalamov. To include the years in the camp, above all in the Kolyma viciousness pole, in a coherent chronological account of his life seemed to me to be inappropriate. And therefore, you see the photo of the table of contents, so you can clearly see the interruptions. So you can see these gaps clear by interrupting the narrative with a purely brief rendering in a different font of the contents of Shalamov's published investigative cases from 1929, 37, and 43. So you see, after the second chapter, you see 29. After the third chapter, you have the 37 and 43. And this is how those pages with a different font look like inside the book. Of course, obviously, it was necessary to take into account the specifics, the aims, and the rhetoric of the investigative documents of Stalin's time, which corresponded to the aims. They provide clear written evidence of the very mechanisms of fabrication of the corpus delicti, so in this case, of the work of the state terror agencies in relation to Shalamov. In order to make it easier for readers, German readers, to orient themselves, these chapters also contain brief information about the region where the Visscher camps were located and the Kolyma camps as well. An account of Shalamov's camp's fate is included in the chapter entitled Writing Camp. So given the literary nature of the text from which we draw the information available to us, in the sequence of his work on the Kolyma tales first, and Visscher and the memories of Kolyma. Thus, in the biographical narrative, there is a gap of sorts. The second chapter finishes with his arrest in 1929, and the third begins with his return to Moscow in 1932. The situation is slightly different for chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 ends with the 1937 arrest, and the fourth chapter focuses on the resurrection of poetry at a time when Shalamov, while still a prisoner, was after the courses of 1946 could work as a camp nurse. This structure seems to me to be justified on the basis of the already mentioned red thread of the book, which was showing Shalamov's journey into literature and his lifelong struggle to have a say in it. Looking at the structure of the whole book, the biographical account of the book on Shalamov still follows the general chronology of his life, meaning that it begins in Vologda with the family setting of the writer's childhood and early adolescence, and ends with his death. It was important for me to first introduce the German readers to the historical and cultural context in which the writer was formed in his early years. And I initially didn't know, wasn't aware how long and extensive the literary and working with sources would be required from me, and I discovered it while working on those chapters. All those chapters and subchapters focus either on moments in Shalamov's personal life or on certain thematic or poetic issues. By choosing the genre of biography rather than academic monography, I have refused to consider the Kolyma tales in the context of ongoing international conceptual debates about the literary word after Auschwitz and Kolyma, such as the concept of literary testimony, literary document, etc. The book does not provide a detailed review of the scholarly literature on Shalamov. Questions of poetics are dealt with, of course, but having in mind the need to introduce the reader who is inexperienced in literary terminology to the range of these problems. The poetics of the camp prose is the center of the sixth chapter, Writing Camp. I had to abandon the chapter in the reception of the Kolyma tales, which was conceived as an epilogue, primarily because of the growing length of the book. There are, however, also moments that either escaped my attention or would have required further study of archives. Archive materials and more time, and I didn't have enough time, and I had to publish the result of the grant within a certain deadline.
Огромные проблемы, что все его личные архивы, почти все его личные архивы были уничтожены, то есть документы.
The biographer of Shalamov faces the problem that his personal archives have been destroyed. Documents and indirect evidence of his life before Kolyma, memories of him and family correspondence are almost entirely absent. We know about his childhood and early adolescence and partly about his 30s, only what he himself told us about through after Kolyma, and what is known thanks to many years of studies of Russian colleagues. And the story of Shalamov's post-Kolyma life can already be based on his poetry, stories, writings, correspondence, and memoirs of others. The story of Shalamov's, the story of his, the title of the book, it refers to the autobiographic practices by Shalamov himself. The biographer of Shalamov needs to be based on Shalamov's books, sometimes his texts, which were not finished. He had a great memory. He had an amazing memory about remembered many facts with remarkable accuracy, and yet both in Kolyma tales and his memoirs, we are dealing with Shalamov's literary imagery. In order to avoid simply paraphrasing what he himself said about his life, I tried to analyze the literary forms and techniques by which he creates his autobiographical self, or rather, the different images of his self. The Kolyma tales are prose of literary fiction, incorporating in a specific way the transformed personal experience of their author. And in his autobiographical texts, such as the fourth Vologda or records of the 20s, there is sometimes the influence of literary topor and myth, in particular literary myth of the underground man, popular in the late 19th century of Russian literature. Traces of this literary myth can be seen in some features of the painted Shalamov's literary self-portrait of his young self. In connection with the documentary basis of the biography, I cannot help but mention the textual problems associated with the incompleteness of many of the poetry and prose texts. By pointing them out, I have tried to introduce the reader, if I may say so, into Shalamov's workroom. The need to highlight gaps to make it clear that it's not always possible to clarify the essential circumstances of the literary event, and Shalamov either omitted altogether or only mentioned in memoirs, notebooks of all letters. There were things that he just omitted or just shortly mentioned. For example, the tales of the journalist's work, for example, or his letters in the case of Sinявsky and Daniel arrest. In these letters, he formulated many things which he omitted and left without answer. There is a third problem, Shalamov's concern for the image of his self. Living and writing were inseparable for Shalamov. Literary writing, the poetic word in poetry and in prose, was a tool for him to comprehend his destiny in life and literature. After Kolyma, the search of his self, the affirmation of the subject of verbal expression had an undoubtedly existential significance for him. I would even say therapeutic point. Tracing of his self-therapy is in every text of his. Shalamov's dialogue with himself required sensitivity of different temporal layers, the time of the events he described or mentioned in the writing, or time of writing of the statement I rely on. Drafts by Shalamov sometimes begin with autobiographical notes, which were dropped from the typewriter. I mentioned already about such case in the story, The Glove, Perchatka. They are often kind of a starting point for the denser fabric of story that follows, or for a more general historical understanding of the time being described by the memoirs. I was interested not only in forgotten details or memory aberration, but in change of perspective on the past, on oneself and on others. These contradictions, gaps, figures of resonance provide an opportunity to approach Shalamov's creative process over a particular text. Also, I would like to mention unpublished text. There is a handwritten text by Shalamov for Mandelstam evening in the Moscow State University in January 1966. This evening did not take place compared with Shalamov's speech at this evening of the Faculty of Mechanics of the Moscow State University in May 1965. It is striking that Shalamov here in particular directly addressed young philologists with a demand to deal not with Pushkin-era poets, but with the problems of the living life, as he said, and living death of contemporaries. I would like to remind between both texts in 1965 and 1966, between these 2 days, Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel were arrested in autumn of 1961. These moments were a peak of Shalamov's public activity among dissidents. There were many texts written there. The text of the presentation, which did not take place, confirms that Shalamov took part in all these processes in the 1960s. And the last. There is also some traces that of the Shalamov determination and his categorical manner in which he defended his belief. He was not afraid of controversy. He could abruptly cut ties with people close to him, not having lived long enough to publish Kolyma Tales and the Kolyma notebooks in the form he envisaged, and without receiving widespread recognition during his lifetime, he was deprived of the possibility of a public conversation with his reader. This isolation, in addition to the deafness, reinforced the concern for the image that the posterity would develop from the text he left behind. The questions remain. Why did he, for example, only in his rough notes about his times as a student, he wrote apparently while working in Vyshara, gave details about what he saw and heard of Adolf Joffe funeral, and in particular about Trotsky's speech he heard there, or about his participation in a demonstration of, for the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution and the opposition student bloc. Why did he, as far as I know, not mention his expulsion from the university? There are many such questions. I hope to be I regard the result of the work, the book I've written, as my subjective approach to the biography of Varlam Shalamov at this stage of my accessible study of his legacy. Of course, my conjectures may be debatable. There may be mistakes. I'm convinced that there will be new research by other colleagues. Thank you very much. So far, I will stop here. Do I stay? Oh, thank you very much, Franziska. I will start with questions, questions and answers session. I would like to ask colleagues to start asking questions. The first question is about biography. Stop, I'm out somehow. Do you hear me? I'm sorry. I'm somewhere. Oh, now it's all correct. You just said that the red line of the book was to show Shalamov's path in the literature. In another lecture of you about Lydia Ginsburg, reflection on Evgenia Ginsburg, that there is a biography and suffering and thoughts. So the biography of Shalamov and biography or life story of other people who lived in this period of time. And in this connection, I have the question, what is the significance of our work of biography? What did we get in this book? Is it a literary biography, or is a list of facts of what the person lived through as a person, not a man of the literature, but just a man, a person? How can we talk about how this past, how his personal story had been lived by Shalamov himself? How was it created? How was it understood by others, different others? And finally, there is a question, what this book is about. What did you create? The biography of what person, or which person? What one can find in this book? It is not easy to answer this question because there is a multi-layered question. There is, of course, first of all, it's not just a list of facts and it's clear. The book is called Biography and Poetics by Varlam Shalamov. Why? Because without texts of by Shalamov, we would not be able to restore many facts of his life. We trace, we saw moments of his life based on what he himself wrote. So for me, it was important not to just repeat it, but describe how it was written, but possibly with details in which genre he used, what special focus he made. On the other hand, you asked whose writer, which writer I described. Without historical reconstruction of events of that those times, and the environment he functioned, it was not possible to understand. It somewhat creates a tension area of the image he creates about himself as a child, or a student in Vologda, or himself in different times. So I needed to have this background, the historical background, which would help to depict his life. On the other hand, it is his literary biography, what I based on. These were his texts. Additionally, as far as the references to Lydia Ginsburg, as you said about Lydia Ginsburg. Lydia Ginsburg in 1980 asked questions concerning autobiographical writing. It was a principle, actually, in relation with different destinies of the 20th century, focused on this suffering and biographies which were not shaped by people themselves. If we think about this message by Lydia Ginsburg, it has been formulated based on the European tradition of self-perfection and growth. So the person, man or woman, himself or herself, is developing and shaping the self. Thus, self implements. On the background of what happened to a person, or a man in the 20th century, it is impossible to imagine differently. As Osip Mandelstam said that the biographies has been spread around.
Целенаправленный рассказ о собственной жизни и тем более биографический.
So the specific sharing of your story and of the fate of yourself is impossible. I see a methodological problem here because I've quoted Lydia Ginsburg's phrase in my book about biographies in Russian literature in the 20th century, Broken Lines, of course, including this the autobiography of Lydia Ginsburg herself. And it seems to me that if I had included the narrative, the story of what Shalamov has endured in the Kolyma camps, in a chronological story, I think this would not have corresponded to the real tragedy, the real brokenness of his life. And hence, this was a kind of a symbolic methodological key to my search for a different form, to omit this, to make a conclusion out of what Shalamov himself has underlined on a number of occasions, that you come into the camp as a young person and you go out as a young person because the camp doesn't give anything positive to you. And so the first basic principles of the Kolyma Tales was to show a person in the camp as a person with no biography. So if I take now pieces of Kolyma Tales and include them in the biographical canvas and biological line of, I would in fact I would contradict and go against his own approach to Kolyma Tales. So this is my slightly chaotic response, but maybe a little bit opening up my approach. Thank you, Franziska. The book finishes with the chapter, which we can translate as longing and yearning for biography. You took out the epilogue about this brokenness and the segmentation. of a biography segmentation. So people with no biography, the quote from Mandelstam. What happened? How does this yearning for biography correspond to this dispersion metaphor? I don't think it was thrown out, as you said now. You quoted the first planned prospect for the book to like my first initial pitch of the book. It's not taken out of the book, but it is present everywhere in the whole book as a red thread. That this whole book keeps the chronological order, but does not follow in a strict manner to the factological chronology, but rather focuses on these principal and fundamental problem that I tried to speak of just now in my slightly chaotic way. So it happened that way that the book, of course, writes itself in a different way from the original pitch of the book. In my original vision of the book, I had more of literary terms and concepts as titles for the chapters. But when I already wrote the book itself, I realized how differently I organized my material now. So the question, can you write a biography creating your own chronology, reconstructing the chronology of Shalamov himself, or at a certain point in the 20s? I don't speak that way of Mandelstam also. And also the issue is, in some literary theoretical articles, I went through those materials and I didn't want to repeat myself and to quote myself and include my literary works into this book. Of course, some thoughts make way from one to another. You can hear some echoes and references clearly, but by the 20, so I approached the 20s differently than I initially envisaged. And another note, but related to this one, whether it's strange or not, but this and it's a subject I might return to in the future, is this formulation. This yearning for biography, it refers and relates to one of the formalists' formulation. Was it Eichenbaum or someone else? Eichenbaum or Shklovsky himself? I'm not sure. And it's interestingly enough that those moments in the enormous pressure and the dismantling of the formalist schools, they started writing works about Tolstoy. Tynyanov was also writing about Pushkin. And this formula that I read somewhere there a long time ago stuck with me. Why is it why is yearning for biography, why does it appear when you realize that your biography is dispersed and in order to and you cannot fulfill your intellectual endeavor and vision? So why does Shalamov has this yearning to write biographical texts about Larisa Eisner, about Raskolnikov, his short article on Berzin, all these works, and his interest to the biography of Che Guevara? It's very interesting, which diverge from the principles of the new prose. And there is a certain, probably a living necessity that he felt within himself, an imperative. It is a mystery for me as well. But within this book, going deeper into this topic, I couldn't devote more space to it. Maybe I will write a different work, a different book on it in the future, or someone else will write it. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the documents, because you can't talk about Shalamov without the very notion of document. In this book, there is a chapter on Shalamov in the 20s, precisely, about the university years, about literary avant-garde, about the working newspaper. There's a reference to Shalamov's words in his letter to Siratinske. There's no fact without its fixation and portrayal. And there's always a kind of return to this subject of document. So how can this evolution of Shalamov's attitudes to what a document is, what is required of a document, how can we trace this evolution from till the 60s and through all the gaps, if we can call them gaps, that happened to him? Can I ask you in turn, what do you mean by evolution? Well, Shalamov keeps for many decades, actually, he keeps discussing what is a document. And for him, he at a certain point, he rejects the idea of testimonies and personal stories, because witnesses can lie, and so the testimonies and stories have to be in the form of a document. And so this idea of what it takes for literary work to be partially a document would match the prerequisites for a document. It started in the 20s with him. It's not a post-camp idea of his. Can you... So basically, the question I have is about how you trace this evolution in the book. In my book, I use the term document in two and not interrelated directly meanings. In one meaning, it's a biographical document of the times. So if we have, I don't know, starting with Shalamov's characteristics, family correspondence, archive documents that relate to his family life, to his personal life before Kolyma. The second meaning of the term, so the first one is the historical document, kind of. The second one, it's already, it relates to the literary text being a document, not historical document, but literary document, art kind of document, art kind of truth. Shalamov, and for him, he sees this. He bases it on the credibility of the feelings, how felt through is, how authentic feelings it can evoke. How can it convey so that the reader can also feel and understand this? I can't find it right now, but I didn't think of finding a Russian original. In one of the letters to Pasternak, he mentions the relations of the form and the contents. And if I manage to convey it correctly, the contents are already in me, but without form, they don't exist. And it depends on the form, how strongly I manage to convey this to the readers. So it is my conversation with the reader, which goes through the form of the contents that I feel. And so the authenticity of how how I feel this. Authenticity also requires talent to convey this, because otherwise it won't be received. And then it becomes an artistic document. And in this way, so a literary text becomes lived through, and a living through category is very important for Shalamov. So it's very hard for me to say now whether for him there was an evolution between the 1920s and 60s, because about the 20s we don't know much. But in the book, I quote about the 1920s is mostly the quotes, so citations from the non-published notes of his for Vishera. He has very emotional accounts there about the demonstration, the author's funeral, but this is very different. There's also about Tretyakov. Yes, yes. But this is, and I think in this way, Shalamov just didn't understand Tretyakov at the time. That's why I'm asking the question. This is my question: how, in so many decades later, he wrote about Tretyakov, and he tried to enter his own shoes, and the young Varlam's shoes, Shalam's shoes, where he. But then he tries to also historically understand the problematics of his times. He now drops it. So it's a very strange literary account of meeting Brick and Tretyakov. But it seems that in order to understand, in trying to understand Tretyakov, and what is that poetics of the operationalist, what lies behind Tretyakov's drive for new literature through newspaper as a field for literary experiment. We don't hear this in Shalamov's account of Tretyakov. It's very strange for me, very intriguing for me.
Thank you. I think it is time to ask your questions. If you have questions, we still did not start to talk about dissidents, but we will definitely do so. Ekaterina, thank you. I would like to return to the question of recognition. You said that Shalamov knew that he was not recognized as he hoped for, and it did not help in his direct conversation with his reader. His experience in the camp also influenced his political convictions, and also it was the reason for his for lack of recognition for himself. What it was important for his relations with the reader, and what became the basis of the recognition of him as a writer and a poet. My question is, did Shalamov imagine his recognition during his lifetime, or he knew that his unique experience and his manner, he described it, made the recognition impossible? The widespread recognition was impossible, and he tried to make his best for his recognition after his death already. Yes, I always, when I wrote the book, I tried to avoid a large-scale speculation, and I'm afraid I am not able to answer this question. And somehow I also do not want to answer this question. I would like to specify, actually, what I meant. Shalamov himself Did he have understanding about his own recognition? Can we make some understanding from his writing, what he fought for and how he imagined this? My answer will be the following. I will read his text. I start my book with his with this citing. It is somewhat ironic. I found this in our archive by Sergei Grigoryansen, and later I will add something to it. I always thought that I'm made of this same, different. From early childhood to adulthood, I have two paths on which I fight with my destiny. It is art and life and art. Press out of life, I become a writer. Press out of art, I am not invited to the Parnassus. Nobody took me there. I myself climbed it, fell and raised and climbed again. When I had a choice, life or art, I always chose life. When I was 21, I went to the camp. I always made my decisions freely, or I thought so, or I thought they were. Also, he wrote, he always thought that he was the writer, who, instead of Shakespeare, would explain the people what the world were. But I think these words are important. They show that Shalamov hoped for recognition. He waited for recognition. There are many references to it in letters and memoirs. He, by his stories about Kolyma, found a possibility to address actually the question of who is man, what a man can do, what a man can achieve, what can be repeated at any given moment, Auschwitz or Gulag. And the achieving of this level of philosophical understanding can be found in his stories about, also in the writing of Nadezhda Mandelstam and others. In memoirs of these people, he had a connection, relations with Irina Sirotinskaya, also in a somewhat different way. He understood that he knew that he was understood and that he would be understood. And the refusal to publish his books and lack of recognition by him of the Solzhenitsyn position was actually difficult for him. And in this sense, there are many thoughts about what literature can do in relation to which level of understanding can be achieved. It is proven by his Kolyma stories, tales, and in many of his poems. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Anna, the floor is yours. I would like to congratulate you, Franziska, with publishing of this book. I have a question. When you wrote the book, Did you have in mind a discussion with a German reader? Which questions did you want to answer? It is an interesting question. Frankly speaking, very few. But there is one question which I had in mind, but unfortunately it was not included in this book. It was not about the history, but I would like to start with a question about the history. It was clear for me that the German language reader may not be aware of many things, and therefore I wanted to write in details, and I wrote more than I intended before. Wrote what the Moscow University was in 1926-27. I wrote more than I intended about the city atmosphere, the Moscow region atmosphere, about what Moscow was during the period. The German reader would not know much about his arrival at Moscow, about the atmosphere of this time, about the historical facts and attempts. I wrote who Adolf Joffe was, who was this breakthrough moment of 1926, 27, 28, 29, about Joffe's funeral. I also found a brochure that historian did not know. Maybe they don't know who was Pavlov. He was writing about the student opposition. So there were not questions and such, but like blind spots in the knowledge, which I found. So I had also to I also wanted to describe what was the situation with literature in 1920s. Also, what there was a question I had to answer many years ago during one meeting when this meeting was dedicated to Shalamov and Solzhenitsyn. I was asked why do not support Solzhenitsyn's letter. Well, I had this question in mind, why I condemn it, but I did not want to answer this question in this particular book because I thought that about Solzhenitsyn it's been written quite a lot. And in the as far as historical so-called services are concerned, in the letters by Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn and others, how it interconnects with the historical studies about Gulag or German concentration camps, or this takes somehow the reader away from the main topic. So that is why we found ourselves in a little bit different spot. Do I answer your question? Yes, thank you. In general, I do accept it. It is about the discussion of the Soviet history.
So maybe your response maybe refers to that actually, that it was a conscious move on your part. Yes, it seemed to me that if I
Уведет
от Шаламова. Уведет от Шаламова.
That it will lead away from Shalamov. It doesn't lead away, it leads to Shalamov, but because the German reader was judging by how the volumes of Shalamov works was received, there's a huge interest to the Kolyma Tales, also on against the backdrop of Solzhenitsyn, but there's all the primary interest is to Kolyma Tales. And so for me, it was important to show that Shalamov is he himself, it's not a coincidence that he writes that from childhood he wrote poems and he wanted to become a great poet. So what did form him is him as a poet. So I didn't want to start with Kolyma Tales, which is kind of the reverse order from the end. Yes, everything we know about the childhood from himself is written after that. But still, what is Vologda? Who in German readership knows what Vologda means? So for me, it was important to give this historical background, and judging by the reaction of the few readers I've heard, is that it was important. I hope. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Тогда, наверное, я задам.
There seems to be a question.
Yes, I was in the premiere of the book, and it was very interesting to have another readership, because I was wondering whether there's also reception of Shalamov in English or in Russian. Is some biography already in Russian or in English language? Will it be read by an international public? Yes, it's my question.
Если я правильно поняла, то вопрос, есть ли другая биография существует?
Did I answer correctly the question that there are other biographies in other languages? Yes, I know that in Russian there's, of course, the biography written by, I'm sorry, by Yesipov? Valery Yesipov in the Life of Wonderful People series. There's a biographic article in German written as a part of a large exhibition several years ago, but this is a short biographical article that does not include so much literary and poetics aspects. And there's, of course, the biographical articles definitely in English, but I haven't, honestly speaking, I haven't read those. But there's a deep book written in published in January of 2022 by Lubir and Son. It's in French, Le Semeur Dieu. It's the title takes the Chlebnikov's words, so it's also poetics analysis aligned with the biographical moments. So these are the works that I know of. Maybe Elena Mihaly can add more.
Нет, я только хотела добавить.
Yes, I wanted to add Luba's works, and you just mentioned it.
So there's a possibility for international Shalamov reception and to discuss the interest of a international intellectual community, why they want to know more about Shalamov and why they want to read that part in their own context, or maybe also to a broader community.
Я извиняюсь, я очень плохо поняла вопрос.
I'm sorry, I wasn't sure. I'm not sure I answered the question correctly. Can you help me? I didn't answer the question correctly.
Yes, we switch to German.
Yeah.
Also dann, das heißt, es gibt eigentlich eine Möglichkeit, so eine internationale Shalamov-Rezeption. Also warum möchte man aus anderen Kulturkreisen auch mehr über Shalamov wissen und vielleicht durch deutsche Sprache als eine Mittelsprache. Ich glaube auf Chinesisch, es wird viele Jahrzehnte lang dauern, um mehr über sein Leben zu wissen. Aber seine Erfahrung ist für uns auch interessant. Es gibt sehr viele Anschlusspunkte.
Спасибо. Я отвечу на русском.
Thank you. I'll respond in Russian. Yes, many years ago, I was in China in Nanjing at the university, and I gave a lecture there. And it's interesting, I met a translator of Shalamov into Chinese, but the very few readers, and he was not very well known. And unfortunately, I don't know more about that, but I think there's interest to Shalamov and internationally. Quite a lot, probably attention goes through English, because there's a new translation of Kolyma Tales recently published into English. And I think so that there will be a stronger interest and attention to Shalamov in the coming years. And there will be a similar book to mine, or mine will be translated into English, because I believe that an international reception of Shalamov as a first league writer and poet only started in the 2000s, and it's actually started with a French translation of Kolyma Tales, because in France the translation was received from a philosophical angle and perspective, and not just historical text that discloses truth about Gulag. So in that anthropological, philosophical framework, I think there is his poetic word becomes even more relevant against the backdrop that we all are very worried about since the 24th February of this year. I think there will be a growing interest to his work. Thank you so much. And I'd like to still ask my question, says Olga, about the dissidents. Yes, please, if I'm able to answer it. Because, you know, our workshop today, seminar is coming as a part of the series of biographies of dissidents, Michael Scannell's biography of Solzhenitsyn. It's about a person who undoubtedly is a dissident of sorts, but also the very environment of the very milieu of dissidents has his own dissidence, his own attitude with just taking a distance towards dissident circles. So my question is, was there an evolution of his attitude toward dissidents and social activities and activism? What was behind that? Maybe we should start with 1965 or 66. Olga, this is a question that I can either give a whole lecture or retell you the whole chapter of my book. This is a very, very large topic. I don't think I'm able to cover it shortly. I don't think that Shalamov was distancing himself or was negatively had a negative attitude towards dissidents, because it seems to me that it's a very complex issue, and it is not very clear, and some things are still a mystery of sorts to us. But it's starting even with the sources and signs that we see that are accessible, we have a picture that is very complex and contradictory in a way. Because let me start from the end. When Shalamov, after the publication of the open letter in the Literaturnaya Gazeta in 1972, is writing to the literary scholar Leonid Timofeyev a letter, and he mentions that for the last 6 years he hadn't attended any public event and he's just living on his own. That is not true, because in 1966 he was completely in a different situation position. In 1966 he agreed to send his manuscripts to the West, and then in the light of that, in 1972, to strike this all out and only underline his anti-Western sentiment, that is not true. That is not true to what his self-perceptions of contradictory material proven at self-perception, because we do have those testimonies from others through whom the manuscripts went to the West, but it's hard to unlock this clash. But at the same time, we can, based on the materials that we see, I can say for myself that and I read everything that I can get my eyes on there, that it was not because of the pressure from Nadezhda Mandelstam and her circles. So it was not because of the pressure, but a lot for him was based on his own hope of publication. So it's not that he was pressured into that. So we cannot bring it down to just the negative attitudes that he had after breaking with Nadezhda Mandelstam and breaking up with the dissident circles. So there's a lot of question marks, and you can't just play it off and play it down. But we also can't speculate. Even if he said something and underlined some of his words, we should always look at the context and the historical moment where this happened. What was said and what had been said earlier, what had been written, noted. What was the sentiment? Was it rage-driven words? And what was the sentiment some years earlier? And we don't know when Shalamov went to Pinsky, when Shalamov had conversations with them. What was the concept of the conversations? We don't know. They were not recorded. So this is all hanging in the air. And we can just mention the facts and base our music on those facts and just outline the situation in broader strokes. So I don't want to give a very strict, concrete judgment, but I just want to underline how complex and contradictory of the situation was. And that's really important for me. Thank you. Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Bella. Bella, do you want to read it or just say it? It's in the chat. You have to go up. I have to look into the chat. I can't find it. The question is about the moment when Shalamov's story starts circulating in samizdat. I don't see it. I don't know why. So with his letter to Literaturnaya Gazeta, Shalamov distancing himself from instrumentalization of his tales in the Cold War. What can be said about the texts that were circulating? Which were the first ones?
What I say is what I know. In Shalamov gave to the editorial of Novi Mir several tales, several stories, and also he submitted to the publishing house Sovietsky Pisatelь 33 stories, and part of them to the editorial of the Novi Mir. partly from there, partly were rewritten and then distributed to samizdat via most probably Nadezhda Mandelstam, and passed further to samizdat. I do not have the exact date. Shalamov gave his tales to be read by his friend Jakub Grodziński. Partly he sent to him or passed when he was in Moscow. He also passed these stories to be written by his friends. Also Shalamov sent his stories to his colleague from the camp. He also passed, so he could pass his stories further. So there were different channels. Also, his stories reached different cities. What I can judge based on what he told to his friends or passed his stories to his friends to be read. Among these people was Olga Rinska. How you call it in Russian? Those who wrote, maschinistka. So those typewriters most probably use this copying paper to make additional copies to be distributed. These were most probably distributed among people whom he met during meetings at Nadezhda Mandelstam's house. There is a separate question about story graffiti. I do not know. I cannot answer this question. Thank you. I would also like to add that there was a moment, and we spoke about it in Moscow, that it was very difficult to study all these networks, as we call, or circles of samizdat, going beyond samizdat. Samizdat, who is this, or what is this? Samizdat is the circle which type wrote and passed further, but also there were many circles of people who were receivers of these texts and distributed further themselves too, and they are quite difficult to research, to analyze. When I wrote this chapter, I also mentioned that these networks were not easy to detect, but they were quite widespread. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, here the floor is yours. Please switch on the microphone. Can I speak German? Because it's hard for me to speak Russian. Unfortunately, interpreters do not translate or interpret from German.
Oder in diesem Zusammenhang sollte ich vielleicht erwähnen, ein Rest vom ehemaligen Jugoslawien. Und ich erinnere mich an die Zeit, als bei uns Kolim-Erzählungen übersetzt wurden. Also das war schon ein Thema in unseren Kreisen. Aber ich hätte jetzt eine andere Frage, die sich eigentlich auf die Frage bezieht, die gestellt wurde im Chat. Also wie würden Sie Schalamows, wie sagt man, Einwand verstehen, also seine Literatur zu instrumentalisieren im Zusammenhang des Kalten Krieges.
Ja.
Also die Frage ist von historischer Bedeutung, aber auch leider gegenwärtig sehr relevant. Also meine Meinung. Vielen herzlichen Dank.
Спасибо большое за вопрос.
Thank you very much for your question. I would like to translate it in short. Gordana Ivanovic is a psychologist. She's not a, she's from Belgrade. When Kolima stories were translated, her question was why Shalamov protested against using him as instrument in the Cold War. It is a topic historically significant even today. Thank you for this question. We just recently mentioned when we spoke about samizdat. But also, nevertheless, I would like to add here one important thing. It is quite an important topic. Shalamov wrote quite a lot about this when he was writing about Pasternak, and he meant himself as well in his memoirs about Pasternak. It was on purpose that I mentioned about it in the chapter, both in samizdat and in the chapter about publication of his prose, as it was seen in the eyes of the Soviet reader, a reader who would not be fluent in the English language or could not read his stories in English. The publishing house Pasek was organized in 1946, and it was especially in the eyes of a Soviet reader, had an anti-Soviet development. Even if they published literary texts, they were conceived as anti-Soviet propaganda. And to be between two political camps and not being seen as poet and writer, Shalamov was very much sensitive about it. Also, the same was his reaction to Nobel Prize for Pasternak. For him, it was quite a sensitive issue. And what I think, in my opinion, taken into account today's situation, sometimes the world is in such a situation, such a state, that a writer with his or her book or literary form cannot protect himself from what is made with his text. He is not having control over his own text. The text is living his own life already. The reader is using this text, the publisher is using this text, and the text is being used for different purposes. And Shalamov was not in the position to consider that in a certain moment the publication of his books in samizdat would be very helpful for him, because it was not the propaganda instrument in this case, but it was a way how to reach the reader, to open the inner freedom of a reader, any reader. Actually, literary piece helps every person to realize, to free a person from inside, not instrumentalizing a reader or a person, having contact with this literary piece. And now, this time, in our times, this issue remains and is actual. Every piece can be interpreted, and the literary piece can be interpreted as something which touches upon very deep layers of the people's nature, human nature. I'm sorry for such a pathetic, high language format, but of course we may be limited by our own understanding. So for me, for myself, there are many questions which remain open. Are there other questions?
Тогда, может быть, я попрошу сказать полслова.
Then I would like to ask you to answer my question about epilogue. Only you managed to do this. This epilogue is hidden between the text itself and the biography, the list of literature. And this epilogue concerns yourself. No, it's just a paragraph about myself. There is not much about this. What I can say. All specificity of this book led me to autobiographic moment of my own life. I would like to start with the following. The last 20 years in the literary studies, it is common to say I am convinced that it is my approach, I believe, etc., etc. When I studied the Moscow University, it is my autobiographical details I studied at the Moscow University in the Zastoy period in 1969. It was common to say we. Now, fortunately, we got rid of such a tradition, and now we say I, me. When I was looking for the style and approach of how to talk about Shalamov's life, I decided that I will not be talking about myself during the whole book. I refuse to use I, the word I. I appears only in the beginning when I talk about the methodology of the book, the work in archives, etc. And later there was nothing about me, about I. In the epilogue, I add an inclusion which has a meta-poetic character. I would like to cite it to you. In this citation, Shalamov actually is talking about the moment when he is in Arbat. He goes to this shop, store, finds something there, and he is hesitant, and he returns to the store. And it happened that in this spring 1971, I thought that actually I had a chance to meet him in this store in Arbat. I was a student at that time. I lived in Moscow, and I also used to go to this store. And I understood at that time, I did not have any contacts with dissidents or samizdat. I was a student from German Democratic Republic. I studied in Moscow as a foreign student. a Soviet German girl. At that time, I was 20 years old. I would not understand Kolyma's stories, even if I encounter them somewhere. It turned out when I finished the book before the war started in September last year, it suddenly came to my mind. I just remembered about this story, about this Arbat, and I thought that actually I was not ready to understand the depth, the depth of his prose. At that time, even if I met him, I would not recognize him, nor as a person, nor as a writer. So that is why I decided to write about this paragraph. And later I continued writing only about Shalamov, about his tales, about the myths, about different storytelling, why and what. So it was something condensed part, which I tried to show and present to readers and to show the main ideas of the book.
Thank you very much. And I think we are approaching the end of our meeting, so bring on your questions because it might be too late soon. Since we don't have any more questions, then Franziska, do you want to say something for the conclusion? Something, the most important, most essential things. Maybe we didn't, something was missed. No, I think everything is said, and I hope the book will find its reader, a critical reader as well. Let's see. I'm very interested to hear your reviews, your opinions about the book when you read it. But in general, maybe one thing I should add, which is crucial. I don't know how, but that there's a huge task to to digitalize the legacy, the written legacy, the legacy of Shalamov, and make it available for scientific research. So make a virtual archive of Shalamov, because we all understand how Shalamov's anxiety of everything being prone to repeating, and how to avoid repeating of history, and how strong should the poetic words be in order to avoid this. I think the importance of Shalamov's poetry and prose will grow, and I think that this task is of utmost importance. I think there was a question now, one more. In the chat, I think, but somehow I'm not able to open the chat. One more question in the chat from Bella Butt. How today in contemporary Russia Shalamov is perceived as an author? The collection, the volume of 2007 it was mentioned that Shalamov becomes more and more important for the culture of memory. So the question is probably what has changed since 2007. I don't know if I'm able to answer that question. I would prefer Russian colleagues to speak to that, because it is a complicated question. Shalamov is being read, and there is interest in Shalamov. But Olga says there's a question. There are two questions. a large-scale question, and what Shalamov means for those who are trying to find some relevant words today in this situation. I think in one context he is not really important and of value, but in a different context his value has grown significantly. I can only agree, says Franziska. It's my assumption, says Olga. It's hard to assess it. We'll only learn this later, says Olga. Franziska draws attention to the hand of Elena Mikhailik. Yes, I would add a small detail. I can't say whether Shalamov's poetics influence people, but there is a sector where we can definitely see an impact. But not on the writing people, but on the film directors. Two latest films of Alexei German, they are a very clear example of an attempt to move some of transpose Shalamov's ideas to a different communication means, to a different art. So at least there we can see a very strong artistic impact, if this is a response of sorts. Thank you. Do you have any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
Es ist keine Frage, nur eine Bitte. Gibt es vielleicht Lieblingsstellen von Ihnen? Würden Sie vielleicht wie in der Buchpremiere wieder eine Stelle vorlesen? Das wäre sehr schön.
Это был вопрос.
This was a question, which is my most favorite part of the book. It's the book, it's in German, so I won't be able to read it today in German in this group, because it would be hard for the German audience here, for the Russian audience here, and I don't think I have a most favorite part of the book. I won't be able to choose one piece, but yeah, Shalamov can be read in Russian. But if we have 2 minutes or even 1 minute, I can read one anecdotal text where it's from the notebook where Shalamov speaks of the poetics of a story as a genre. A very short part that I found in the archives. In the beginning, there was the word. It was a story of 2 words, and there are no ghosts, said I. Really? Said my neighbor, and disappeared. This is this world ideal of a novel. It's short. There's brevity, which is a sister of talent, and there's a very compelling novel plot of a story that has accompanied humanity from the cave times to Yuri Gagarin times. And this is something I wanted to share with you today. Thank you. Thank you so much for today's conversation to all of the participants. Thank you to Franziska. Thank you to everyone who asked questions and listened. Very soon, well, in some time, we will have the recording available on the website. We will probably also transcribe parts of the conversation to publish them in written form. Thank you very much for the invitation and for everything, for the conversation and for attending and for your questions. Thank you. Thank you and goodbye.